Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first Bristol Schools Forum of this academic year. I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping and start off the agenda. I think most of you know me, but I'm Sarah Lovell, and my role at the moment is Vice Chair of the Bristol Schools Forum. So as I said, I'm just going to take us through the first section. The current chair, Karu, has stepped down, so I just wanted to initially just take a moment to say thank you very much for everything that he's done for Bristol Schools Forum. So in terms of general housekeeping, if I can ask everyone to keep their cameras on, but also make sure that they're muted unless they're contributing to the discussion. If you have got something that you would like to say, please can you raise your hand in the function, and that will be picked up as an opportunity then to discuss papers or raise questions. We've had one question in advance, which we'll pick up as we go through the meeting. So in terms of first agenda item, that is in relation to the appointment of the new chair of Bristol Schools Forum. And I'll hand over to Karina, who is our clerk, who will be able to take us through that process. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've had two people put their names forward, Christine Townsend and Simon Eakins. If you could, as according to the Constitution, this is a secret ballot. So if you could, using the chat function, open it and make sure that you're sending the message privately just to me, put in your preferred candidate, and then I'll count up the votes and announce the winner. Can I just check that everyone's voted that wants to vote? can declare that Christine Townsend has been elected as chair.
Congratulations, Christine. I'll pause now on chairing the meeting and hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So if we move on to the item number 3, which is the election of the vice chair. Karina, did you get anybody come forward for that, or is there anyone that's wanting to come forward for that?
Can I just ask people now, is anyone interested, would like to put their name forward to be vice chair?
I'd be happy to put myself forward as vice chair. I realise I've been doing it for recently, so also open to a change, but happy to nominate myself as vice chair.
Is there a seconder?
Can I second?
I think we've got a second. So is everyone happy for Sarah Lovell to be elected as vice chair? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So if we move on to the standing items of business, for those that are new, we have standing items obviously on every agenda meeting, and the clerk, I'll hand over to Karina to run through these items that are on agenda item number 4.
Thank you. So we've had apologies from Carew, Raynell and Rob Davis, and also Carew, his term of office is ending at the end of October, and he said he's not seeking re-election, so this would have been his last meeting. We are quorate, no resignations to report. Would anyone like to declare any interest that they would like me to record? No, okay, thank you.
Okay, so moving on to agenda item number 5, which is the minutes. What I'm not able to do, have I got control of this now? I don't know whether I need to share the minutes, or are you able to do that, Corinne, like to share the papers?
If people have got it on Zoom in front of them, they can half the screen and see it at the same time on their screen.
Okay, if people have got the skills to do that, I've got an iPad in front of me as well.
Just a PDF up there, so it's quite straightforward.
Okay, so shall I ask, has anybody got any items of accuracy for those of us that were there in May at the last Zoom meeting? You would indicate to me.
Chris?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so it's just on page 3. Let me just have a look a second. It was with regard to the HR systems iTrent, just a little clarification at the end. It says had now moved to the new system. That should be has now moved to a new external payroll provider.
Have you got that, Karina?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other items of accuracy? No. Okay, I'll take that as a no. So, are there any items on the in these minutes that people aren't seeing coming up somewhere else that they wish to raise now for discussion? Go on then, Chris.
Let me just come off mute. Right, okay. So it's on page 8. This was in response to some questions we posed that we had to send in after the last meeting, wasn't it? It's to do with, if you like, question B. So it was a table. I'd requested that the table for insurance, maternity, free school meals and ed psych were portrayed as they had been for the other 3 items in the de-delegated. And the response I received was that it had been spent to budget, so no movement or carry forward. I must admit, I was surprised to see that that was the case for them, especially for the maternity, that it was spent to budget, given that that's kind of 18 months in advance when the budget's actually set.
Chris, specifically about maternity, there is a reserve that was used to balance that to budget at year end. So the maternity did spend to budget last year.
And over.
And over, but it was balanced to budget or balanced to available funding by drawing down from the insurance reserve that's there, that's been built up over previous years.
So there is, if you like, a carry forward, term it reserves, if we like, carry forward from previous years. It was used to supplement 1920s expenditure.
Yes.
So could we have that in the table then, so that we could see that in effect the maternity, there was a shortfall, if you like, within the actual financial year?
Yeah, I can do that.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Is there anybody else that wishes to ask anything about the questions? There's various people that asked questions of these papers. I'll take that as a no. I have a question in relation to the Temple Meads Oasis. Alison, are you going to deal with that in your section?
Yeah, I've got that as part of the director's update, Christine.
Okay. So in that case, shall we move on to the next item on the agenda, which will be the finance subgroup that met, and that is for you, Alison, to give us a debrief of the finance subgroup, according to this.
I don't think it is. It's probably Graham.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I hadn't noticed that my name was down against that. Sorry, the subgroup, we met on the 25th of August. We had a discussion about the latest monitor, but there's an updated monitor later in on this agenda, so there's nothing really to report from that. At the time that we met, we didn't have any update on the funding formula from central government, from the ESFA. We've now had some updated both guidance and indicative figures from the SFA, and the last item on the agenda today is talking about the funding formula and the allocations for next year. But we did discuss what we were going to do with the formula, because if forum members remembered last year, we moved as far towards the national funding formula as we could in the available resources, and the subgroup had a discussion and effectively decided that now we've made that move, we would not want to move away from that national funding formula now. In the announcement that the government has made with this year's funding or next year's funding, they are still talking about introducing a hard national funding formula in the future, but they are still looking at how they do that. So in terms of the funding formula, obviously we will be discussing that later, and we will be consulting with schools. We talked about, we discussed the growth fund and de-delegation. I'm just trying to look at my note. I'm looking at my notes from the meeting, and we discussed the high needs and the education transformation programme. Again, these are things that are all on the agenda for today.
Are you suggesting then that we pick them up then?
I think the subgroup, all the discussions of the subgroup have actually they've been built into the papers that have been written for today. So some of them have led to some of the stuff that Alison's put into her paper on education transformation, and some of the other things we've built into the paper on next year's funding.
Okay. Shall we move on then? So the next thing on my agenda is the verbal update from yourself, Alison.
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that what you've got as well? I think my paper's a bit out, but
yes, yeah, I'm expecting that with my name against it, which is good. So in terms of the update, this is now going to be a standing agenda item, and obviously some of the sort of matters of the moment and priorities are far and wide with regard to education and skills. So what I want to use this agenda item for is to really look at those areas that I think would be of particular interest to Schools Forum, either because it's obviously linked to finance or because they're areas that we've discussed previously. Just before I start, I just want to say thanks for everyone who is school-based for prioritising this meeting this evening. There's a huge amount of pressure on colleagues at the moment, you know, within our schools and settings, regardless of role. So I'm just really grateful that you've managed to find time to attend tonight's meeting. And the first item really unsurprisingly links to COVID. And, you know, a thanks to all the hard work that's gone on across the sector to prepare for the start of term. I think this has been the most unique September we've ever had, both in terms of school-based staff and also our families, children, young people. It's extremely complex and pressurised, and that is obviously having an impact on the sort of just the day-to-day delivery of education, but obviously it's beginning to reach into other areas and you know, create potential delays or complexities. I think you'll know from some of the media coverage, we are beginning to see some positive cases in schools. I think last count we have 11 schools who have at least one positive case. Majority of those are children and young people, but also a few members of staff. And the reason I mention that, not particularly from a sort of clinical COVID perspective, but this is going to start impacting, I think, particularly on schools' budgets as they start to really respond to the reality of COVID through the autumn term. Which is why I wanted to mention it in this meeting. So just feedback anecdotally at the moment from head teachers I've spoken to, obviously supply costs and increased costs against COVID, we really need to start understanding as a system. And we obviously have captured some of that and are looking at raising those pressures up through various routes. I think particularly in terms of our sector, the early years settings, nurseries and post-16 are particularly adversely affected because they don't qualify for the additional funding that has come out from the department as schools do. So I just want us to be really mindful of this as we start getting a very clear sense of what that pressure looks like as we move through the autumn term. I think it would be worth us reflecting on that and reviewing that as a forum as well, obviously, and that may influence some of the outcome of the consultations that will happen with regard to funding going forward. So that's the first area. The second area is related to the alternative learning review that I know we've talked about a number of times through this forum, and has been within the pipeline within education and skills for a number of months and years. Just to say, I'm pleased that the work has actually started this week. Obviously, it's much later than originally planned due to the original lockdown and inability to move this forward. But we have appointed somebody independent to run this review. The review will take place over the next 2 months and obviously engage alternative learning provisions and EIBs, early intervention bases, over those 2 months, and create hopefully a very comprehensive review. The key ambition really of the review, just to articulate it here, is to gain a full understanding of how alternative learning and early intervention bases are being used across our city, and to enable that sort of transparent decision making with regard to placements, funding and other areas that we don't necessarily have that full transparency about at the moment. So obviously one of the outcomes comes of that will be to bring that back to this forum, as obviously that is a key area that the forum is interested in, both in terms of the delivery, but also particularly in terms of the financial arrangements. I'll go through all of these and obviously open up to questions against any of these at the end. The next one Christine's already mentioned is regard to the Year 7 sufficiency, and particularly the sufficiency issues within the East Central BS5 area. Another focus has been obviously on sufficiency in terms of the school forum, and particularly watching that bulge through primary that has now been hit in secondary, and we know peaks next year for September 2021. Many of you are probably aware of the proposed new free school, which was part of the wider Silverthorne Lane site, and the planning permission delays that have been sort of plaguing us for the last however many years with regard to opening the Oasis Temple Quarter. Although that was approved by the planning committee in August, that there are still lack of firm confirmation of that, and there is a potential that that planning will be called in by the Secretary of State, and that's a period of time we're working through at the moment. Obviously, on those ongoing delays have a direct impact as to whether or not that school can be opened in temporary accommodation through this free school process for September 2021. And we've obviously been working closely with the Regional Schools Commissioner Office and the Department for Education to look at the options surrounding that. We've received formal confirmation from the DfE that the Oasis Temple Quarter won't be open in temporary accommodation due to that ongoing uncertainty with the planning. So that is now no longer an option for September 21, and we've articulated that through the BS5 Parents Forum as well, and so they're aware of that. So therefore, the work that's happening at the moment, and it is obviously happening at speed, given that admissions, the admission window is now open from now until the end of October. So we've been working on those alternative plans, and they will be communicated once they are confirmed, but it won't be an option of an additional school or setting to open in that area. It will be built on the existing provision with regard to extending the pupil numbers and looking at how we can ensure that we are able to accommodate more young people in that area at Year 7. So again, we'll come back to, once we have that absolutely firmed up, we will come back to Schools Forum to let you know the impact of that. And then finally, just with regard to composition, which was obviously another piece of work that was discussed, I think 2 Schools Forum ago, with regard to the constitution and the composition. We'd agreed to review the membership. Again, that is something that has sort of been delayed due to other priorities. We talked about it in I think it was either part of the finance subgroup or certainly the planning meeting prior to Schools Forum, and it's still something I'm certainly keen to look at to make sure we have the right representation across the city on this forum, and to really look at the role of the forum with regard to the very clear priorities that we have as a city. So it was agreed that we would come back to that particular piece of work probably January, given that November will be quite financially focused. So that's the main updates I have. Christine, do you want to open up the floor to questions?
Thank you. So there were 3 main areas then, Alison, from what I heard. There was COVID, the new school, and what the plans are for the immediacy of Year 7 2021, and the forum composition. So if anyone's got any questions related to any of those 3, if they indicate, and then hopefully myself, Karina, Sarah will be able to see. I think, Karina, you're able to see, aren't you? I can see that Chris has actually got his hand up, so.
Okay, yeah, so it was just to reiterate what Alison was saying about if you like, the ongoing COVID costs. Obviously, schools were able to claim a rebate, if you like, from the government, but that was only based up to the end of term 5. So schools have already, if you like, incurred costs in term 6, and now it's escalating again in term 1, especially around, staff having to isolate, and therefore, supply costs are coming into play. And again, we've still got the hygiene and the cleaning, extra cleaning is required. and that's going to have a significant impact, just from what I can see on school budgets this year. And really is to try and press, central government to see what relief they can actually provide us for this.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that we would all support that. Denise?
Yes, thank you, Christine, for coming in. I think one of the key points that possibly hasn't been accelerated is the challenges that schools are having with the additional COVID cost and burden. I think I'd be happy to provide some support as necessary and accelerate some of these pressures through. We have regular meetings with relevant departments and Treasury, etc. as well, in terms of the council's challenges. And I'm more than happy if you want to send some of the details to Graham to collate that and actually also try to put some pressure on the DfE and Treasury to ensure that the additional costs are met. I think it was interesting, I think Alison mentioned that early years has not been reimbursed. Now, clearly that hasn't been accelerated to me, but I'm also more than happy to take that forward, early years and post-16, and put that in our responses to Treasury. But I think I need to get a collation of the quantum and then start to make representation on your behalf as well as the councils.
Okay, thank you. And I can see Will's got a hand up as well.
Yeah, thank you. Similar to what the last two speakers were saying, I was just wondering, could anyone from the council give any concrete details on what steps the council have been taking to lobby for extra funding so far?
We have, in terms of the council's funds, and where we are aware that there are other pressures, then we will be lobbying. But at this stage, there's been very little information that's come through to me in terms of the COVID pressures attributed to school. Hence my plea that if that can be collated, then I can put that in response. We do written response to MHCLG, and we actually have virtual meetings with them to discuss pressures. And we also are about to send in our comprehensive spending review outlining some of the challenges and pressures. So again, we have a number of opportunities to have a forum with government departments to discuss COVID challenges. So I think what I'd be keen to have is the details of the pressures collated, potentially maybe sent to Graham on behalf of schools, and then I'm more than happy to take that forward, but also ensure that we've got member representation as well, and that it's on their agenda, and that we highlight this in as many different forums as we possibly can.
And just to add to that, William, the routes we've had previously within education has been very much directly up to the DfE. So we've been lobbying, obviously, as guidance has been received. Examples would be free school meals and looking at how we then feed that back. We have weekly meetings with representatives from the DfE to feed back our response as a city to that guidance and where we feel pressure, both in terms of delivery and financial. And also there has been a real engagement in terms of lobbying from council members and MPs across the city on a number of agendas since the start of this as well. So I think that this final sort of piece is to really make sure we capture the reality of the financial pressures and raise that upwards.
Okay. And Simon, is that yourself?
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, head of St Philip's Marsh.
That's right. No, I'm grateful that Alison and Denise have raised the thing about the lack of recognition of the role of nursery schools by the government in any of this, and not having access to any of the funding, additional funding, or even the huge struggle we had getting free school meals for our children. It was a complete nightmare. So, and the costs have actually been quite considerable, and we're under extreme financial pressure as it is anyway. So I think I'm glad that that's been recognised and acknowledged. And I also understand that there is a promise again from the government for a comprehensive spending review at the end of October to look at the funding formula for nursery schools. And this has been pushed back and pushed back, but hopefully that at least there'll be something that we can work with, which should be coming forward. But in the meantime, it would be good. So I could actually, if you'd like, I could just circulate to the nursery heads to just send in like a spreadsheet with additional COVID costs, who would I send it to? Who would it go to?
Can I suggest initially that you send it through to Graham, that can send it on to myself? We're in the position now of just about being submitting our comprehensive spending review response. That's due this week, but we will also be doing our MHCLG submission as well for the council's COVID pressures. We have a section at the end where we can capture a lot of additional things that maybe aren't in there. I'd probably like to put something in there about these pressures as well. So if we can get that through to Graham, and then I can incorporate it into the end of September response to government as well.
Okay, thanks. I'll do that. Cheers.
And just to add to that, Denise, we'll put the, I wrote to nursery, maintain nurseries head yesterday, and actually that was one of the statements within that. So I don't think it will come as a surprise, Simon, in terms of gathering that information. We'll make sure that also goes out more widely through the weekly bulletin on Monday, so that we can really get a clear sense of what those pressures are as term has started across the city, rather than, in addition to just nursery.
And Chris again. I can see his physical hand.
Sorry, yes, sorry to interrupt again. One thing, if I could ask Denise, if you could perhaps put into this month's end of month report, is to do with universal infants free school meals. That given the, if you like, the attendance which may be prevalent on the 1st of October when the census is being taken, and the fact that, should we say, that a lot of schools are having limited meal options, that will significantly impact the grant for next year if there's no allowance for that.
Right. Chris, are you able to summarise key points as well and send that on to Graham, and then I can incorporate it in September's submission? Okay,
no problem. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just checking to see if anybody else has put their hand up. They haven't.
Christine Cedric, I just posted something so everyone can read it. But,
okay.
Maybe I guess for you, Alison, with the risk of closure coming ahead and the return to homeschooling, I was wondering if BCC was going to kind of provide some guidance in terms of what type of platform will be used and option we will have for our children, and also because all schools will have to anticipate such a cost as well associated to it.
In terms of is that to do with the learning platform in terms of online learning?
Yeah, it would be online learning, yes.
Yeah,
so if there's any recommendation across all the primary as an example, yeah.
Yeah, at the moment we've been leaving that very much down to individual schools to deliver what they're able to and what they have the kind of capability to deliver from a digital perspective. I suspect this will be an area that Ofsted will become more interested in as we move forward, particularly if we see many schools almost operating that dual system as cases increase. At the moment, there's no expectation for schools to use a particular platform or portal. We've obviously previously recommended some of the national portals that were put in place during lockdown that are still available and exist. The other issue that we obviously need to address is the digital poverty that we have across the system, and I know there are a number of working groups and sort of forums looking at how we do that and build on the digital device allocation that we got directly through the DFE. So I do think this is a piece of work that as we move through and we sort of come away from the current urgent pressures, that we need to look at something that possibly pulls the city together more in that area. I think it's a fair point.
Okay, thanks, Alison.
Okay, I have a question. Alison, if you can you outline the catch-up situation, because the government kind of said, yes, we'll give you some catch-up money. And also I'm aware that attendance is a huge issue across the city. We've already had children needing to self-isolate in various schools. You just outline for us how that impacts or otherwise those two areas because of COVID.
Yeah, certainly. And I touch on attendance actually through in the education transformation part of it as well. With regard to the catch up, there's funding that has come out nationally from the DfE that have gone directly to each individual school and setting, through a small amount through obviously the National Tutoring Programme, and more widely to be used as schools and settings see fit in terms of that catch up. Again, in terms of a local authority's role within that, we don't have governance on as to how that's used. That really is for schools to assess those gaps as children and young people return back into school through the autumn term, and to use the framework suggested by the DfE. So that will be something, we've got the Excellence in Schools group later this week. I'm obviously keen to get some feedback from schools as to how that's going. And we can again certainly use this forum as an update against that. But the funding has gone directly to schools for that, and it's allocated according to the size of the school, so it's a formula-driven allocation. With regard to attendance, that probably is one of the highest priorities for us as a local authority in our sort of advocacy role with children and young people, particularly obviously those who are categorised as vulnerable because they have social care involvement or education, health and care plans, but also more broadly, really making sure that we use the support and the priority on this in terms of getting more and more children and young people back into our schools and able to remain in schools. That's obviously for Bristol been an area that we've not been great at in terms of our performance with attendance. So I really do see this opportunity as a point to make sure that we get it right and that we build up from the significant focus we have on this and the significant resource we have on this from September. So really working with schools, with families, and when I update in the education transformation, there's obviously a reference to a new attendance and belonging group that's a sort of task-driven group in order to make sure that we increase attendance across the city and we don't have anybody not returning.
Okay, anybody else for those three areas that Alison was talking about?
I think Chris has his hand raised as well, Christine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, Christine. Just
okay.
One thing on the back of what you've just mentioned about the catch-up funding and everything like that. Graham, are you able to let us know when do you think that will be processed to schools?
To be honest, I'm not sure, Chris. I've been on leave for a few days, so I've not seen that announcement come through. So I'll update you. I'll have to update you after the meeting. Yeah,
that's okay. Because I noticed it hadn't come through in September's formula, so I was just wondering if it would be October's.
I will update you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, I can't answer that at the moment. Sorry, Chris.
Okay, no worries. Thank you.
Okay, I can't see anything else, so I'm going to assume that everybody's satisfied and we can move on to the next agenda item, which is the budget monitor paper. So I think that's yourself, Graham, or Travis, is it?
Yeah, I'll talk to this one.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the first budget monitor of the year. Obviously, we didn't. The budget conversation we had in May was about the outturn, so this is the first time we've had a budget monitor, and this is showing the position at the end of July, which is the end of period 4. Obviously, the key table is table 1, which is on page 16 of the pack. Obviously, you can see we started the year with a £2.8 million deficit. Sorry, my wife's phone is ringing. I'm really sorry about that. I'm actually not. I'm not at home at the moment, and everything's a bit up in the air. I'm actually a few hundred miles away in the Lake District. So we started the year with a £2.8 million deficit budget carried forward from last year, and forum members will remember that included the £2.4 million of accelerated funding, which effectively is from this year's funding allocation. If you look at the table on page 16, table 1, you can see that schools block, school central block and dedelegation are all forecast in a balanced position at the moment, no in-year variances. Mainly that's because we're too early into the year to have any changes due to census figures in any of those areas. You can see there's a small pressure in the early years block, and most of that is from emerging SEN, which is causing a pressure in early years. Again, there's not any variances on any of the core funding for both our maintained nurseries or external providers, because those are all based on census data, which hasn't been taken until the middle of the autumn term. Obviously, the biggest pressure there stands out is the high needs block. At the moment, we've got an in-year variance of over 3 million on the high needs block, and that is even taking into account the additional funding that's gone into the high needs block from central government this year. Most of this pressure is in top-ups, and I think it's a reflection of the increased demand, and a lot of that increased demand is as a result of the really good work that the SEN teams are doing on getting rid of the backlog and pushing more EHCPs through. And it's all the stuff that we're doing in response to the Ofsted inspection and the stuff that's contained in the written statement of action. But that's actually having a knock-on effect in the finances. Obviously, we are, Alison will talk a little bit about the transformation programme side of it, but we need, and we've started to gather quite a lot of data to do some proper activity reviews and some analysis and some trends looking at past years to see whether this is just a blip or whether this is an upward trajectory. So yeah, I mean, obviously that, as I say, high needs block is the area which is causing us, is giving us the most pressure at the moment. It can be, we can explain it, but it's not a sustainable position at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So I can see that Ruth has put her hand up in the indication box. Ruth, do you want to ask or make your comment?
Yeah, it's a bit of a juggle, trying to juggle the papers and your mic and your whatever and find everything. But yeah, a couple of questions. One was around the top up. It's probably a question for Alison, really. I was talking to somebody the other day, and it may not be right, but what they told me, it was a Senko, they said that they'd received more top up than they'd asked for some children. I just wondered how many schools, or whether we can look at how many schools actually got more than they asked for in terms of top up. And if we've got such a really big problem with overspending top up, it seems a bit odd that any school would get more than they actually asked for. So I wondered whether that could be looked at. And the second question was just slightly further in the paper, it talks about commission services. And if I'm reading it right, the commission services have an overspend. And I'm wondering why, if we commission, we'd commission to overspend, if you see what I mean. But there may be a very simple explanation that I don't understand on that.
I can certainly pick up the first one, Ruth, and then this is related to the top up that we had to allocate during lockdown. And so what we weren't able to do was have the range of face-to-face meetings and forums. It's quite a detailed piece that involved a lot of schools, 100 schools coming in and having all of those face-to-face meetings about individual children, young people. And we had to move at speed and create a sort of formula-driven piece that absolutely isn't ideal going forward. It's the only time we've ever done it. And what that meant is there were a small proportion that ended up with slightly more and a small proportion that ended up with slightly less. There were other elements to that sort of prioritise various different areas to make sure that the funding was absolutely in line, particularly those with a high level of needs. I don't know the numbers of how many ended up with more. I don't think it was significant because that was the best solution given it was a formula driven piece. We are working to, now that particularly now we obviously are not out of this particular situation, and unlikely to be able to do a face-to-face one again for the next round, which I think, I might be wrong, but I think that might be November. We obviously need to have something that's a bit more intuitive now that we've got a bit more longer to plan for it, basically.
That's helpful. I didn't realise it was done on a formula, but
yeah,
maybe if we're going to do it again on a formula, we could say it's a formula, but we're not going to give you more than you need, because, you know, it really doesn't seem very sensible when we're trying to, you know, be careful with every penny of it.
Yeah.
And if you want me to, do you want me to
sorry, yep.
answer the bell on the commissioning? The commission is made up of a number of lines, and some of that commissioning is for ALP, alternative learning provision, and obviously when we set the budget, we know what we're commissioning at the time, but obviously as there's more demand, we might need to commission additional services. So it's not, we don't set a budget and that's what we've commissioned. We might need to commission extra as we move through the year.
Okay, so will that be looked at as part of the ALP review then?
Yeah, it is being done at the moment, yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And Simon, I see you got your hand up.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, two Simons.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Beg your pardon. I didn't see who went up first.
Neither did I. I don't mind, whatever. Well, shall I just ask my question? Because it'll probably be a very quick answer.
Yep, go on then. Yep, you're on the screen.
I mean, and I apologise in advance if it's a stupid question, but I just think, you know, we're all being asked to think outside the box, which is a good idea. And we've been told that we're in the biggest national crisis since World War II. Education is a national priority. And yet we've got enormous pressure, which it doesn't seem to me any simple way out of on our budgets for the most vulnerable children in our city. Does the local authority have any power to use its reserves in a national crisis in order to support its most vulnerable citizens? And is this something that Schools Forum can make a political case to the powers that be that they should be used in these circumstances? As everyone keeps saying, they're unprecedented. Education is a priority. We're in very different times. Maybe we should be making a bigger ask rather than endlessly just trying to, you know, it's like getting blood out of a stone or something. We just don't have the money. Is that a possibility, or is that just off the scale?
Could I respond, Alison? Okay, so I think there's a couple of points that Simon has made. One is in terms of it is unprecedented and it is a national crisis, not only for the education sector, but for the local authority as well, in terms of the scale of its own financial challenge, which is very well muted, both publicly and also in terms of our medium-term financial planning. At present, we don't have sufficient reimbursement to cover the additional cost that we've incurred and income being generated, and are constantly making representation to government in order to meet our cost, but significantly having to dip into reserves in order to do so. The key point in terms of the high needs deficit is that you recall last year that the guidance restricts local authorities from using general fund to meet the deficit that we see in high needs, which is what we currently have now. And we have asked the question in terms of how much of this spend is attributed to COVID, because I believe that if we can demonstrate it is attributed to COVID, then there is a different representation that could be made. But the initial feedback is that this isn't COVID related. It's purely as a result of clearing the backlog and also the new plans, etc. So I think what we need to do is do the analysis and details to be really clear on what is driving the cost, what is the pressure, is it purely the backlog, or are there some other factors of which we could pick up and also address collaboratively. but at present the guidance doesn't allow us to utilise general fund to meet DSG deficits, but also we've got to recognise the local authorities' own challenges, and that we also have not only 2021 challenges from COVID, but we also have the next 3 years challenges from COVID as well, of which at present we're being asked to fund from our own reserves. So it is a double-edged sword. So it isn't a single challenge that we're trying to address.
If I could just jump in there, Simon, just to give you a sort of example of the scale of the new reality for us in terms of what's driving the funding. If we just take education, health and care plans, for example, the team have finalised nearly 200 more plans by the beginning of September than they had in the full year last year. So we're talking about a significant increase that equates to additional cost that's coming through the system, and it's a good problem to have, but there are financial implications against those figures.
Can I ask about the council's reserves in relation to education funding, because this was something that I raised at the pre-meet, if Graham and Alice would remember. I heard 12 million being mentioned at a cabinet meeting of late that was we had the word education next to it. You remember when I raised that at the pre-meet?
Yeah, sorry, Christine. I think that when the final accounts are drawn up and the reserves are put in on the balance sheet, all the education reserves are put there on one line, and the 12 million represents all the balances of all the maintained schools. So it's not the utilisation. They're not available reserves for the council. They're the amalgamation of all the schools' individual balances together.
I see.
There are some other small reserves. So I mentioned earlier in an answer to Chris about a maternity reserve. So there's a small maternity reserve. There's a small reserve for the de-delegation, the other de-delegated items. But the majority of that 12 million is schools balances. And I think I would double check the figures, and maybe I could send you an update. But I think the 12 million was the opening balance, not the closing balance. Okay. So I think the 12 million also included the £2 million balance on the DSG at the time as well. So I think it was like something like 10 million or 8 million for schools, 2.5 million for the DSG, and then little pots of other money. So it's the non-general fund reserves, and they're badged in the final accounts as education.
Okay. The other Simon, did you want to ask your question, or has it been answered?
That's great, thank you. Just a question, just on that paper where it says the brought forward deficit on the high needs block of over 3 million.
3.5, yeah.
When I look at the papers that we looked at when we looked at the final outturn for 1920, the high needs only had a deficit of just under 500,000. Is that to do with the effectively the allocation of 2021 money in advance, and that 500,000 that was shown last year was kind of already accounting for that? And my second question is, I think I raised it back at the time when we looked at the 2021 budget for high needs. It had it breaking even, so no more deficit, which I think I raised at the time, saying it sounded unrealistic given all the work that's being done around high needs, and that's obviously coming through. But actually, how realistic is that? Only increasing by another 3 million, and I presume when we come to our next schools forum, that figure may even go up.
Okay, so there's a number of questions in there, Simon. So yes, the outturn figures would have been year-on-year funding, but that didn't include the 2.4 4 million advanced funding, so that would have been added to that. So that's why that might look different. In terms of setting the budget as a balanced budget, effectively that's what we have to do. We have to set a balanced budget. We can't set a deficit budget. So we have to set the budget in the available resources that have been given from the ESFA. And your other point about this possibly increasing, I think you're right. Then these figures, as Alison said, we've increased the throughput of things like EHCPs. Not every EHCP comes with a pound sign at the bottom of it. Some of it is done on core and commission services, but an awful lot of the EHCPs do cost us extra money. So it is likely that that in-year variance will increase going through the year. There's other things that we wouldn't have known about in period 4 either. Things like some of the post-16 places we don't find out about until beginning of September, effectively, the over numbers places in the high needs block. So yes, it's likely, you're right, it's likely that figure might increase.
And Denise?
Thank you, Christine. I just wanted to add to that a little bit and to probably answer Simon's question in a little bit more detail. When we originally set the budget last year, you can recall that there was a significant increase in the funding that was allocated to high needs. And at the time, when we looked at it, we could see that there had been significant growth allocated, which sort of aligned to our indicative outturn position. Hence, the budget or achieving the budget looked more realistic. Hence, I think at the time we had requested or worked with you in terms of the transfer and aligned more funding to the improvement programme as opposed to the specific high needs commissioning activity. What's happened subsequently is, a clearance of the backlog and detailed additional expenditure. Our indicative analysis indicates that is going to increase and it's going to increase further. Hence, we need to do much more analysis to try and look at the trends and sort of start to think about the full year effect of some of the packages that have been agreed and extrapolate that and work through what we believe that the end position will actually be for the year, because I'm not of the view that it will be the figure that is currently reported. Graham will talk through some of the next year budget, but again, the government have been doing a lot of roundtable reviews and discussions in relation to high needs and SEND, because I think it was well recognised at the time that they may have given an additional fund, but they hadn't given any funding to address the deficits that many authorities were carrying, and there wasn't sufficient in the funding for growth. As a result, they've tried to recognise that, I would say, within this year's funding, and we'll discuss that. Next year's funding, we'll discuss it shortly, but I think our challenge will be, is it going to be sufficient and will it address the deficit? So we may be in the position of indicating to government it still isn't enough. But we'll probably have a bit more of that conversation when we come to the indicative funding envelopes that are outlined.
Okay, thank you. I'm just checking to see if there's anybody else that's got their hand up in any of the ways that we can indicate, and I don't think there is. So we are being asked to note this as an information item. Are people happy to note? Yep, okay. So if we move on to item number 9, which is the Education Transformation Programme. And this is yourself, Alison?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Circulated a report outlining an update on progress, both in terms of against the spend, but also the sort of deliverable milestones that we looked at when the 1.3+ million was transferred and allocated to this work. I'm going to make the assumption that you've had a chance to look through it, so I don't propose to go through each area in detail, but I do want to obviously highlight some of the exceptions within this, and just sort of get a general feel really from you at the end, whether this is the level of detail you were anticipating in order to monitor both the spend but also the impact of that spend, which I think was a concern that you'd not previously had, the transparency on the funding when it's been transferred from the high needs block into something else. So just in terms of the general progress, progress has been made against each of the areas. However, some of the milestones you'll see from the RAG rating appendix haven't been fully met. The performance and ability to meet the milestones that we have, I think particularly against the backdrop of COVID, has been good generally, but also bear in mind that some of the work for these July milestones will have started ahead of when that funding is transferred. So I think the kind of the bigger risk that we have really with this, and more generally with the written statement of action, is obviously how we continue to meet those milestones for the November milestone measure, given how complex some of the activity has been. I hope that you'll see from the paper that there is clear governance in place with regard to monitoring the work and the spend against that work. We've got internally a lot of scrutiny and challenge over this piece, and that's sort of the ultimate place that's held is the Children's Improvement Board, which the formal SEND board is part of that, and that's independently chaired by a member of the Local Government Association as well, so brings that external scrutiny to it. In terms of external scrutiny, obviously we are subject to monitoring visits, formal monitoring visits by the Department for Education and NHS England against the written statement of action, and that first formal visit took place in July, and I believe the communications about the outcome of that will be shared on the local offer shortly if it hasn't already. Just in terms of the paper that I've submitted, obviously it includes a review of the funding activities against that transferred high needs block funding, followed by the July milestones, which I brought is an update to the ones that you will have seen at the previous schools forum. And as I say, a significant amount of work went on to try and protect a lot of this activity and this focus through COVID, to make sure that we were able to meet some of those milestones. In terms of the ones that I wanted to highlight, I think if we just refer to the page 22, I think it is, to about page 25, I've just pulled out those key headline areas rather than going into line by line that's in the appendix. So the first one, obviously, again, that's had some high profile coverage recently, is a specialist provision project. And this project is about creating additional specialist provision across the city in order to meet the current shortfall that Bristol faces and has faced for a number of years. The good news is that we were able to have face-to-face sessions with our city leaders across the education sector. Literally, I think it was about a week before we ended up in lockdown. And what that was really launching with heads was the collective challenge that we have in the city with regard to lack of specialist provision. So that piece of work took place, and there's sort of different phases to this as a project. So the first phase really is to address the urgent need. So what we ask for schools, both those that are maintained, those that are special, those that are academies, we ask for schools to really think about how the specialist provision can be provided, not just through additional places at special, but also through mainstream as well, whether that's through resource bases or other ways of meeting that need. And we had 78 expressions of interest from 30 schools, which is a really positive outcome. Obviously, the big piece of work then needed to be to look at each of those, to look at it from a feasibility perspective in terms of the actual buildings and capital programmes, to look at it with regard to where the need is in the city. So, certainly of trying to keep the expansion to the type of need that's required, but also in the area of the city that's required, so that provision is local to families. And so all of that work had obviously started, and then lockdown happened, and that really did have a really negative impact throughout the summer term. We basically lost the summer term in terms of being able to undertake those feasibility studies on site at each of the schools and settings. So we've picked that piece of work up, but unfortunately that we have experienced delay. There are 3 phases to this strategy with regard to those increased numbers of specialist provision, and the first phase obviously is being worked on at the moment. We're trying to identify where we can get some quick wins that are easy, either very small pieces of capital expenditure. The provision is already there, it just needs some adjustments or diversifying slightly. So we're trying to really prioritise those that we can deliver quickly. It then goes through to the more complex investments and builds that would be part of sort of, you know, next spring terms development. So there's an obvious route through for this, but it obviously is further behind than we would want it to be at the moment, which is a shame because we did get off to a good start on that. So that's the specialist provision project. Just moving on down, I'll go through the key highlights, and then obviously the same as with the director's update, I'll take questions at the end. The other piece of work, just for information really, is the first call, which was all about having that sort of front door for families in relation to SEND. Just to let you know that that's being rebadged as the local offer live. What we felt was with the first call is it was too confusing with first response, which is obviously the front door for safeguarding. So we want to make it really clear what that looks like. The work that's been prioritised at the moment is really supporting families, current families with who are in the system, who have EHCPs, and making sure that, obviously going back to the attendance piece, that we're having those conversations and looking at risk assessments and supporting families to successfully get back into school if they're not able to at the moment. And that piece of work started during lockdown. So we've been able to be quite flexible in terms of that local offer live resource, which has been really useful over these past few months. Top-up funding we've already talked about, and obviously one of the key pieces of work in terms of the education transformation is to completely review the way that top-up funding is allocated. So actually this sort of picks up on Ruth's point earlier, and come up with and create a new model. All of the consultation has taken place. And so that piece is now the main piece of work that's happening, is that obviously the finance framework that sits behind the matrix is being developed at the moment. That's quite a significant piece. The other thing to just mention there is we had quite a bit of debate about the fact that this piece of work had started, was focused on schools. However, there was absolutely the need to have a similar approach to early years top-up funding. So we've been able to expand that project and continue with the schools at the sort of pace that we were, but also make sure that we're able to incorporate early years as well, which I think is a really positive way forward. I think it would have been hard to then do a separate piece for early years following that. Just in moving on, in terms of other areas, really just to highlight, obviously the attendance task group I just want to pick up, which is at the end of page 23. This has been the attendance and the sort of focus on an integrated joined up approach between education and skills and children and families, so children's social care, has been absolutely critical during lockdown in terms of wrapping around parents and carers and really working together to try and successfully make sure children and young people are safe, but also make sure that they're back into schools where they can be. So we've taken that a step further through this programme and through the funding that was became available through that transfer, and we've established an attendance task group. So that's led by a member of staff who is full-time on attendance and reaches through to all of the different service areas that play a part in this system, because it is a system approach. It's not sitting with one individual team, and really making sure that there is that integrated approach, that there is that operational delivery of improved performance with attendance, that we are monitoring and absolutely on any child or young person falling through that system, whether it's child missing education or any of the other categories that we're looking at. Part-time timetables, for example, is another area that we need to get better sight on across the city. So that is a significant piece of work that really, responds to the situation that COVID has created, but as I said previously, was already an area that we needed to develop and resource. And actually this allows us, this is one of the positive opportunities I think that has come out of this crisis, that really enables us to scrutinise this area in a way that we haven't been able to before. And then just finally, one of the areas that we weren't able to make the progress on, we wanted from a strategic perspective with regard to the written statement of action, and obviously here has been some of the co-production projects that were in the plan to deliver for July. A number of reasons for that. Challenges due to face-to-face. It hasn't stopped all of them, and where co-production has been able to happen in a meaningful way via virtual technology, it has, but obviously capacity for children, young people and families to engage, capacity for staff to come away from the crisis and firefighting that they were doing to develop a piece was the biggest challenge. So we've raised that obviously as a concern here, but also more widely in the written statement of action as well, and looking at ways that we can address that, particularly if we end up in this prolonged period of semi-lockdown, or certainly the virtual world that we're inhabiting at the moment. Hopefully schools and settings being open to all pupils will improve families' capacity to engage as well. So I think I mentioned that I think our sights are very much on the November milestones. Obviously, we need to, through the SEND partnership group, we're looking to see whether there are any areas that we absolutely can't deliver, where we can significantly catch up from maybe areas that were red or amber in the July milestones, and also continue where we had green, continue to build on that and deliver green in November. So it's a significant piece of work to really make sure that our resources are focused on those things that we can actually deliver, and we're not sort of chasing things that can't happen for one reason or another.
Okay, thank you, Alison. There were, from what I heard, 3 areas that you specifically focused on. So the creation of new places in special schools or mainstream schools that may wish to adapt or add new facilities for children. The area around attendance and the co-production with families and children. I could see that there are 2 hands so far that have indicated that they wish to ask questions. Ruth, you were first, and then Aileen.
Okay, thank you. There's lots that's really positive in here, and I do understand it's virtually impossible to do a lot of stuff with COVID, but what I'm really worried about is our pupils with SEND and their career progression, because there aren't going to be any jobs for any young people at the end of this crisis. It's a flipping nightmare for anybody, but for SEND students it's going to be really, really hard, and I'm really worried that our year 10s will have lost out any opportunity to do any work experience because of COVID. So they're going into year 11 without that. Lots of the careers work's been stopped, and I noticed that in one of the tables it said that there was a target to work with 420 young people with SEND around careers work, and that we haven't worked with any of them. And I think we need to really urgently think how we can do that, because this is absolutely crucial for our year 10s and 11s. And if we don't get it right in the next bit of the year, we're kind of condemning them to a lifeless, work with a life without work, really, because things are so dire. So I'm just wondering how we can pick that up, and whether we can be really innovative and creative in the way that we do engage with those young people with SEND.
Yeah, and I share your concerns, Ruth. I think if we look at things like the increase in the unemployment rate, we know from previous austerity measures that young people's unemployment is adversely and disproportionately impacted when we see the general statistic go up. And there's a huge amount of work happening with Jane's area and the skills agenda, and also in conjunction with WECA. So 4 key work streams have been set up through WECA that are funded, not necessarily directly to Bristol, but through those planning meetings and those operational delivery groups. Those 4 areas focus on apprenticeships, youth unemployment, and looking at things like the digital poverty and creative ways into getting meaningful experience, and obviously positive destinations from that. So that's probably the thrust of the work that the skills teams are doing at the moment, to see how much can be brought online, to make sure that we're monitoring those most at risk from an individual's perspective through that period. And there's a lot of resource sitting there to do that. We've obviously made sure that we sort of redirect our funding to support that as well. Added to that, we've obviously got additional programmes that are coming out from central government, Kickstart being one of the most recently announced one, which is about providing the salary to enable young people to have work experience for that 6-month period at a full salary with additional training and resources costs. We're obviously looking at how we support the rollout of that across the city. Within that, how we, as I say, really prioritise those young people with SEND, those at most at risk of having sort of long-term disengagement or unemployment. The other piece of work that we're doing is obviously that is a finite amount of funding, and there is a risk that in 6 months' time we just hit a cliff edge for all of those people that have just suddenly been engaged, with that work experience. So what Jane and the team are doing is really looking at how that can then lead to a positive apprenticeship experience and a pathway into paid employment going forward. Obviously working with post-16 providers on all of these issues as well. So it's a really worrying piece, but there's a lot of thought and planning going into how we can try and reduce it.
And Aileen?
Yeah, thanks very much. And the post-16 strategy group that Jane works with, there are some really good things coming out of there, and a really good plan to make sure that as many young people with SEND can be in employment. I think it's very difficult in the current climate, and I totally agree. And I think it's great to direct the funds in that way. And also there's lots to commend about what's happening at the moment. I think there are great leaps forward, and the idea of the SEND School Improvement Officer, where Bristol City Council funding and commissioning best practice within the city. I think, particularly in the special school sector, there is great expertise. And if we had the funding and the capacity within the sector to share some of that with mainstream colleagues, it would be to the benefit of everyone. And particularly in an outreach model, which can end up saving money in the long run. So if special schools or specialists can work with pupils within the mainstream settings, then perhaps early intervention can prevent the need for EHC later down the line, or a special school place being necessary. It's about making sure that intervention work is happened and quality and funded. So there's, I think there's some great things going on, and also the projects to try and make sure that there are extra places across the city. I think that's fantastic, and really pleased that so many places expressed an interest, and my school's expressed an interest, and we're one of the first, I think, whose project goes forward, which I think is amazing. I just wonder how the decisions were made, and if there's a report about how that looks across the city, because I think there's a lot of knowledge within the city, and if we knew where the places were situated and what the plans are for the city as a whole, then strategically as mainstream and as special schools, we can support and perhaps advise where there might be gaps emerging. So that's a question. How do we know how the decisions were made, which projects to progress and when? And the other question is also a little bit about transparency, the belonging and attendance group. I think attendance is a key factor, and there are lots of people I'm sure would be interested in inputting or hearing what the group is doing, or what how it moves forward. There are many groups within the local authority, and it seems there's lots of great work, but it doesn't tend to be disseminated well. And that's the final point about the communication in terms of projects. It's it's not always easy to find out where you put in an expression of interest, and then you don't know when the decisions are being made and what kind of timeline is expected of you as a school. So I think it would be perhaps in a head teacher's briefing, some regular updates on those sort of projects that are going ahead that would be useful for the community, the education community as a whole, to know what's happening and when.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. I'm heartened to hear that final comment, actually. And I suppose part of me has been deliberately avoiding trying to give too much updates on things. The feedback that I've had from school leaders is that there's a huge amount of information coming through from all areas, and if it's not critical and COVID related at the moment, kind of don't go there. So I think I absolutely agree. I think it's a fine balance. I think we're moving into hopefully a period where we can start coming back to some of that strategic work that's been happening that I haven't been talking about to heads for very obvious reasons. I think your comment about disseminating information down and opening up some of the groups in terms of attendees is really important. There's always that balance between trying to get something off the ground and delivering it really quickly, and then actually making sure that you're taking people with you through that communication. So something like the belonging and attendance group that was only launched, I think it was last week or the week before, in a decision as to who from across the different services need to come around the table so that a decision can be made there and then, or certainly they're happening fortnightly, certainly within a really short period, to unclog something for a young person, or to challenge a policy that can be changed pretty quickly. So it's about that balance between driving ahead with something and then obviously making sure that it's open and transparent. So I absolutely take that away, and I think that's an area we need to get better at. Just in terms of your first question about communication with the project, we're obviously still working through some of those feasibility studies, and what you've mentioned, that sort of mapping of what we've ended up with, will absolutely come out as a piece of work from that. In terms of the decision making, it's been fundamentally, I think probably the key areas, obviously there's been other details that have been looked at, but the sort of key areas that you're looking at is, does the building accommodate that change, and how much would it cost, the reality of how much would it cost to do that, and is that within a sort of financial tolerance for what the outcome would be, i.e. how many young additional children, young people would it accommodate, so is it value for money? So finances is obviously a big part of it, and whether or not that build can happen from a planning perspective. The other part of it obviously is to look at where the school or setting is, and then where the need is. So, for example, there may have been expressions of interest that are meeting a need that we only have in one part of the city and the school is based in another. So again, they may be not considered appropriate to take forward, because we don't want to get, be back in this situation of transporting children all across our city for provision that we can provide locally. And then other elements may be to do with where the school is in terms of staffing, its previous capability with regard to supporting SEND, whether or not there would need to be a significant amount of input from a kind of pedagogical perspective in terms of branching out into specialist provision. And then the final one really is there's obviously a very, and you'll be aware of this, there's obviously a very clear governance route from an academy perspective as well, that we sort of are running parallel to decisions that we're making in the local authority. So decisions on anything related to an academy has to go through formal head teacher boards, which obviously I think November is the first one that we're able to present against with the current timeline. So all of those factors are considered for each of those individual expressions of interest. That will then be sort of worked up into a final plan of those that are going ahead. That's absolutely when we need to come back round and say, okay, here are still the gaps, this hasn't worked, this is what we need to do in this part of the city for this age group with this type of need. It's as specific as that.
Okay, thank you. So Ruth, have you got another question, or is that your hand that remains up?
Sorry, I'll put it down.
Oh, okay, right. Sorry, I just didn't want to. I want to make sure. Okay. just checking that there's nobody other questions. I just have one, Alison, about early years, and can you, whether you can just quickly outline where early years, if there's I can't remember if there's a specific piece of work or whether it's sort of embroidered throughout.
I think obviously there isn't a specific piece of work because obviously this is the high needs block funding, and so early years will be part of the kind of, rather than a specific line, it's part of some of those wider pieces. So for example, if you look at the specialist provision, that is looking at need from you know, early years through to post 16. It's
Right.
not sort of exclusively excluding a particular cohort within that. So the majority of them are kind of woven into something more broadly as opposed to a direct piece of work on early years. For this particular funding, early years appear in more widely in the written statement of action that's obviously using funding from elsewhere to support.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's all the questions on. Oh no, Sarah's got one. Okay, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Chair. Unfortunately, my raised hand function doesn't appear to be enabled, so apologies about that. So initially, I just wanted to say thank you very much, Alison, for a very thorough report. I think being able to see that level of detail at forum meetings is very helpful, and being able to understand exactly what is being spent on and seeing the impact is very helpful. So thank you for that. Just in terms of the impact of the coronavirus, and just thinking about us being able to deliver the education transformation programme, I think one of the challenges with this type of thing and the impact of the pandemic is that you've sort of almost already committed salary costs, but not been able to actually achieve your objectives. So are we thinking that, and this may be picked up in the next item on the agenda, but are we thinking that we may need to actually utilise some of next year's DSG to be able to complete the programme to its full extent? Or do we feel that there's enough left in the pot at the moment to be able to originally deliver the original objectives of the programme?
I'll obviously hand over to Graham or Denise to maybe talk about that more broadly. From my perspective, we're not, some of the salary costs have obviously been paid, but for others, you'll see we haven't spent against budget yet, and we're still, you know, looking to appoint. So for me, this isn't a piece of work that will neatly end in April next year. Some of this will absolutely be ongoing. So the piece of work that we're starting is to look at our service planning for next year, looking at the education transformation work, you know, where we see that pressure continuing and how we kind of fund that going forward. I think is now we're starting to get into the period of we need to look at what that's going to be and what that looks like. I don't know the answer to that yet, and again, Graham or Denise may want to add something from a kind of financial perspective. But for me, this isn't something that just can neatly be tied up in April and fit into a financial year, particularly now with COVID.
Did Denise or Graham want to add anything to that?
I think the only thing I'd probably add is, in reality, just reiterating Alison's point that it wasn't intended to be a one-year programme. We'd anticipated that it was going to go across multiple years, and that hence we'd earmarked the fund in such a way that it is able to be carried forward if necessary. I think the key point is getting an early indication, Sarah, of whether or not there is any reprofiling required to the original plans as a result of, you know, of having the staff and not being able to follow through on some of the plan. But I believe that those officers have actually been utilised for alternative propositions and elements of the programme, and been able to accelerate different elements. But I think what we'd need to do is wait to see what the outturn is sort of looking like for the programme, but managing it at a programme level. Clearly, there will be decisions to be made in terms of next year's funding, and Graham will go through those in terms of potential transfers or movements between block. But I think it's for the forum to think about how you want to best utilise resources and optimise the funding that is available to address all of the challenges that we're seeing in all of the different sectors. But I think when Graham goes through what the options will be, but in reality, it's definitely intended to be a medium-term programme rather than a 1 year only.
Thanks very much, Denise. That's really helpful. I think from my perspective, I wouldn't necessarily, I understand it's a longer term programme, but our only recourse for additional funding is the next year's DSG. So I was more looking at it from that angle rather than saying it's finished by April, tick the box. But just thinking about funding, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't think there's any more questions on this from what I can see. So I would propose that we move on to item number 10, which is for Graham, and it's the update on the DSG for the next financial year.
I'm actually going to defer to Travis to start with.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm going to start off and introduce this paper. Thank you. So towards the end of July, the ESFA released some information. It's by far from complete, and it's only indicative. I really can't stress that enough, on next year's allocations, and also some of the updates to the formula regulations and other sort of constraints around how the DSG operates next year. Now, the information which was released is incomplete. It talked about some schools block, it talked about high needs block, and it talked about central services block, but there was no information for early years in that at the time. And also the information and the numbers, particularly the monetary values in there, have been calculated on the 2020, the current pupil cohorts, which of course will be updated following the autumn census to derive next year's allocation for the new formulas. I feel I say that every year. I do say that every year, but at the moment it's the best information we've got. But to start off with, they have changed a couple of the data sets for the schools block formula going forwards next year. Mainly, they're going to use the 2019 IDARCI data, so the income deprivation affecting children's index for working out deprivation. We will remember a couple of years ago when we moved from the 2011 data set to the 2015 data set, it caused some interest. So again, we'll be moving from the 2015 data set to the 2019 data set, but the indicative values in this paper have been based on the 2019 data set, but this is funding in, not about how the formula gets distributed yet. The EFA have also indicated we will still retain a degree of local discretion. We are not moving to a hard national funding formula yet, although they have published NFF values, again, which are based on these indications coming in. Okay, so some headlines on there. So for schools block, nationally, Department for Education are putting 4% into the schools block with a funding floor to LAs set to ensure that no LA gets less than 2% growth on per pupil led funding. They've also looked to increase the minimum per pupil funding levels at primary stage, at Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. You'll remember last year that they made the minimum per pupil funding levels mandatory when they were optional before. They remain mandatory, but now at a higher level. But they are further complicated. The increases also incorporate some of the teachers' pay and pension grant. Forum will be aware that the teachers' pay and pension grants have been paid separately to the funding formula this year. Going forwards, to try and reduce administration, I think more for the SFA than for local authorities perhaps, but they are incorporating that teacher pay and pension grant funding into the schools block formula, which is being reflected in the higher minimum per pupil funding levels. For high needs, again, nationally, they're introducing £730 million into the overall funding pot, and they've said that each LA should not expect to receive less than 8% per head increase. Now, the figures are indicative in our table here, but it's looking at, if I turn my page, at around an 8.5% increase based on our current pupil cohort. And again, as with schools block, the teachers' pay and pension grants for high needs payable to special schools have been incorporated into this allocation, and the LA will have to pay out those pay and pension awards on the same basis from the high needs block as well. As for the central services block, we've seen that begin to reduce over the last few years as the ESFA and Department of Education looks to unwind the historic commitment funding. And again, there is a reduction on the historic commitments, which for Bristol is the potential borrowing element, which we have previously transferred before, so that element be further reduced, although the entire reduction isn't fully reflected because there is a small increase because, again, teachers paying pension grant strikes, central services teachers, centrally employed teaching staff will have their pay and pension grant incorporated into that block as well. So it's not quite as neat as it could be there. Table 1 presents the figures as published. We have tried to align the current pay and pension grants as best we can alongside the current allocations and put them alongside next year's published allocations to try and give some comparison. So for schools block, it's looking at 2.7%. Central schools block is reducing by 2.6%, and the increase on high needs is 8.5%. And so overall on the DSG it's 3.6%, but of course this is before the pupil update, and there is again no early years information at yet. Restrictions, again, they're moving towards a hard national funding formula at some point, but again, they're not introducing it next year. So we still retain some degree of flexibility, but not a huge amount. The minimum per pupil funding levels are going up, so that will take the lion's share of any formula funding we put in. Again, the minimum funding guarantee as opposed to minimum pupil funding levels are going to be positive. So again, long-standing forum members will remember it used to be -1.5%, then, and that had no choice over it. Then it became 0%, which was for us to set because we could go up to a positive value. And as per last year, it is now being at the minimum it can be is plus 0.5% and up to 2%. Last year we set at 0.5%. One of the things we'll have to consult on is what we set our MFG at going forwards. And talking of the consultations, we'll have to consult on the minimum funding level guarantee, on any block movements, and on whether on the dedelegation, which will be presumably voted on for November's. And that, in a whistle, is the paper. There was some more information released by the SFA made public at the very end of last week after this paper was released. It was mainly concerning around the methodology around distributing the teachers' pay and pension grant from next year's allocations, specifically for high needs, that we'll have to top slice the high needs block because place funding is going to be remaining at £10,000 and top up is associated with pupils. So we cannot pay the teachers' pay and pension grant awards to special schools via place funding or top up, and it'll be a separate exercise to pay out from there. Essentially, that is what was in the paper, and that's it for me. Any questions?
Sorry, I muted myself. Okay, so if people have any questions, if they can indicate, please. I can see everybody that's in attendance at the moment. So if you indicate if you've got any questions. So the three areas I'm going to consult with then are the minimum funding guarantee, block movements, and the dedelegations just with the local authority schools. Is that correct, Travis?
And also Bristol is funded at a higher level than the national funding formula. We get more money than we strictly need to apply the minimum funding, the national funding formula values. So again, members will remember that last year we had a very small amount of headroom to allocate. So if we go only to national funding from the ORPU and the other factor values, we have a little bit of money left over, which we are obliged to give out. So we have to decide where we're going to give it. Last year, when we consulted, we could have enhanced the ORPU slightly, or we could have enhanced the additional extra need factors. And I think normally last year we certainly put it into deprivation and EAL. So again, the question will have to be asked. We don't know the values yet, but I don't know how much money room there'll be, but if there is excess over and above going to the NFF values where it wants to be applied, if we go to the ORPU and give it out to everybody via the ORPU, or if we give it out via the deprivation factor, for example.
Okay, thank you. And I had one other question, which was about schools that could possibly have their minimum, they've been funded on a prediction of a cohort as opposed to an actual cohort. Have we still got any of those schools in the city? And if so, have you done that work that we were speaking about last year about, okay, how does their actual cohort compare with the cohort that they had their funding predicted on? And do we need to do any MFG exceptional requests to the EFSA as a result?
Okay, so there was 2 schools which we had effectively proxy funding guarantees for. So Trinity and the other one's Steiner, because it's gone from all through to primary age only. The advice from the SFA was that we had to use Steiner as an all-through school, and they're putting an adjustment through in this year's DSG to reflect the reduction in their age range now that they're Avanti Gardens. And as for Trinity, they will have a real pupil cohort for next year's formula, which will supersede anything which has been used for this year.
Okay, thank you. So has anybody got any questions for Travis on that? I can't see any. If you can, Karina. Simon. Okay, thank you. He's put his clap hand up. Yep, go ahead, Simon.
Quick one, Travis. Obviously, when we did the analysis on kind of who benefits from the movement to national funding formula and stuff, what's your feedback from schools? I mean, certainly from my trust, even though we're quite a small mixture of primaries and secondaries, is the primaries found it a lot harder this year to put a balanced budget together. Primarily, I think, because the national funding formula tends to favour the secondary schools. Is that the general feeling that you got from sort of the maintained schools, the primaries finding it harder? And, you know, should we be looking at that for the 21-22?
Sorry, thank you, Simon. As again, particularly members of the finance subgroup will appreciate the last couple of years of modelling towards NFF. The national funding formula in Bristol favours secondary schools and larger primary schools. The smaller primaries generally see a smaller funding share, but they are protected under the minimum funding guarantees to some degree. And the introduction now of the minimum per pupil funding levels has also offered some enhancement to some of our primary schools as well, although many are funded above those minimum levels already anyway. I'd probably say the biggest challenge to our primary schools in setting balanced budgets this year was their static or maybe even reducing numbers on roll. Where pupil numbers are declining in a school, they don't get protection for that, and we're not allowed to protect that. And Forum a couple of years ago voted to get rid of the falling rolls fund, mainly because very few schools would have ever qualified for it. So yes, Simon, you are right. Anecdotally, primary schools are finding it harder. Movement towards NFF values does prefer larger schools and secondary schools. But I'd probably say the biggest challenge for our primary schools is static and falling rolls with increasing costs.
Okay, I don't see anybody else that's indicating that they wish to ask a question or make a comment. And so that brings us on to AOB. Obviously, I've not had anybody bring that to myself. Denise is putting her hand up for an AOB.
Apologies, Christine, it's not an AOB. I wonder whether colleagues should very quickly outline the next steps in terms of consultation, whether there's any inputs they require from the forum in terms of how that consultation will be framed and whether there should be recommendations from the forum. But I'll hand up to Graham and Travis, if that's okay, Christine, to just summarise that from the paper.
Yeah, that's fine. So I'm working on producing the consultation document now. It'll be asking very unbiased questions around movements on the block transfers, if we're going to propose any or not, just what thoughts are, what schools would prefer to see the minimum funding guarantee set at in the range +0.5 to 2, and whether, if there is any headroom on schools on the schools block funding after we've implemented our preferred, well, after we've modelled our options, whether we divert any additional money into the ALPU or if it goes to the additional education needs factors such as deprivation and EL.
So just in terms of clarity, Travis, will you work with the subgroup before that goes out, or will it go straight out? Because it will be before the next schools forums meeting, won't it?
It'll have to be before next forum meeting to be able to bring it to forum to get the opinion, and we can actually take the real formula forwards then.
So is there apologies, it feels like a two-way conversation, but is there a plan to have or convene a subgroup meeting to discuss the content before it goes out, or do you believe that we've done sufficient?
I don't have a meeting scheduled yet. I'd quite appreciate one. If we can coordinate that, that'd be very useful. Thank you.
I suppose the only thing there is that there could possibly be a timing issue. At the last forum, at the last finance subgroup, we did talk about these things, and a lot of them are carry forwards from last year as well. So if we've made the move last year and had the discussion and the consultation last year, it's almost a confirmation. Is that still okay? Rather than asking yet another new question. We wouldn't want to move away from the national funding formula now. We move towards it. We wouldn't want to move away from it, because one of the reasons for doing that was to try and stop a cliff edge in funding for schools when the national funding formula becomes hard. And things like the minimum funding guarantee, we chose the lowest for a reason, and the schools all supported that. So again, we'd probably just want confirmation that we choose the lowest minimum funding guarantee again. So by all means, we could have a finance subgroup, and actually it might be quicker and easier to convene now that we do them virtually. So I suppose, Christine and possibly Sarah, whether you think it's worth us doing that.
Sarah, have you got any thoughts on that? I think I would. I'm certainly be willing to put some time in to have a look at that.
Yeah, I think it would be good for us to have the finance subgroup. I do also agree with what Graham said. I don't think it's going to be particularly different to what we consulted on last time. I think the only variance might be whether or not we want to put that additional headroom that Travis mentioned into the ALPU or back into deprivation, which was the one that we debated previously. But I think having taken this outside of the meeting and going through it in a bit more detail would definitely be a good way forward.
Okay, so Karina, could I ask you to put out a specific date or make contact with myself, and we can try and arrange that. And if anybody is wanting to join us, then please do. The more voices and the more input the wider and the more variety of input we have is really useful for us to hear those different perspectives. And particularly for new members, what it might do is enable you to understand a little bit more about what it is that we're discussing, because I'm very aware that a lot of the work that we do in Forum is really, really technical, and it can take people quite a long time to understand the differences between all the different acronyms, and it's quite complicated in terms of how schools are financed. So it might be of benefit to people that are new or returning or something to join us, where they might feel that it might help aid their understanding. I just had one question about the maternity supply cover, because that did come up at the subgroup, and it became clear, or it was indicated, that there's something about one maternity cover pot for all local authority schools, but actually it might not necessarily be evenly spread across the primary and secondary sector. And I know that's something that's specific to local authority schools. And you remember when we had that, when we spoke about that?
Yeah, I remember that. There was some concern that because obviously we've only got 2 maintained secondary schools now, so there was some concern that they were not putting in enough to cover their side of the dedelegation. I have confirmed, or been able to confirm, that they are covering their own amounts, and that the primary schools are only covering their amounts. For next year, if both primary and secondary vote for dedelegating the supply cover, and depending on the rates that we charge, we will look at keeping those pots of money separately. At the moment, we keep them separately in a virtual way, but we will be able to do that properly in the ledgers by coding them differently, and we will do that from next year.
Okay, and Sarah, you mentioned, well, we asked the question as to whether it might be more financially beneficial for our local authority secondaries to maybe look at a different form of maternity supply cover, because obviously there's a different system that the academies used. I don't know whether you got any further with that.
Well, I think I was just reflecting on it from my position in the federation where I work, and we've not taken out maternity, not necessarily pursued insurance cover for secondaries because it is quite costly in terms of benefit. But I'm sure there's something I can take away and work with others if that would be helpful to share something in relation to that position. I've also noticed that Karen's got her hand up patiently there in the background, and I think she might have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. It was relating to Travis's report. My thoughts were that if there is concern at the falling roll numbers in primary and the impact of the funding relating to that, can the subgroup looking into that look specifically at those projections? Because we may need to bring something to forum to revisit the whether or not we reintroduce a different funding allocation that recognises a falling roll, because it does have quite considerable implications to primary schools, particularly small ones.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think because the policy that was in place only applied to secondary schools, because there was no way at that time that there was going to be primary schools that weren't able to fill their places because there was a crisis of shortage at primary. That's now moved into secondary. So if that's something that the place predictions can be brought to the subgroup, we can have a look at that. And we may well want to replace that for the primary schools, but they do have to be the good, outstanding. And what we'd also need are the 0 to 4 predictions, so that we can show that those places are needed in the future. So I think it's a good point. Thank you. Any other points or comments that people wish to make? I'm just flicking through. Okay, I think that's all then. So is there anything else that people wish to raise or bring? Chris has got something he's indicating with the little hand.
Yeah, it was a note for any other business that I sent through to Karina yesterday. It's to do with, it's for local maintained schools. We have our Q2 outturn to be produced at the end of September and to be submitted by the end of October. And this goes back to right at the very start of the meeting, when Alison sort of indicated how the landscape had kind of changed a lot within the school environment, which it definitely has. So the question I wanted to ask was, could local authorities be afforded a month's grace in order to do that outturn, so it would then be submitted by the end of November rather than the end of October, just to give a little bit of breathing space to schools?
Hi, Chris. Yeah, thank you. Your question came to me. I've talked with TWS as well, and the reporting deadlines have been established. They've been out there some time, so we're not looking to move, but of course we will work with schools and be accommodating and issue any short extensions should any particular circumstances require that.
So not even in the current COVID situation. I know that the dates have been out there for quite some time, but I think I'm right in saying that academies have given them, they've been given an extra month at the end for reporting at the end of the year, and really just wanted some parity for local maintained schools to have some kind of breathing space.
Sorry, Travis, I wasn't sure whether you were coming in again there. I think Travis was sort of making the point that the reality that we're happy to work with schools if we believe that it's a significant challenge across many schools to be able to accommodate this if necessary. But I think it was around those that can then clearly do, and where not, then we would work with the schools to have some extensions as necessary.
So who would we need to just liaise with for an extension?
Is it yourself, Travis, or is it with TWS?
In the first instance, if your reporting goes to TWS, so if you're having difficulty meeting the deadline or would like a small extension, then speak with Jane and her team in the first instance, as they then collate all of that information for later reporting.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, so I think that's all. I can't see any other hands raised in any way. So our next forum meeting is on the 24th. And given the announcements today, it's going to have to be over Zoom again. Unfortunately, we were chatting as to whether it might be possible to be in a room together at some point, but for the foreseeable future, it's looking like we're going to be doing this again over Zoom. So thank you to everybody for your time, and I'm pleased to say we are 11 minutes early, so that's not bad, is it? So thank you very much, and we'll see you in November. Bye-bye.